Welcome to our BL Touch install guide. To kick this guide off, we're going to tell you exactly what you'll need to get the job done. Pictured here is a BL Touch and a 3D printed BL Touch mount, which you can find in the description. Next, you'll need a pair of wire strippers, a soldering iron, solder, and a small piece of heat shrink tube, the 2 and 3mm Allen keys from your kit, the clippers that came with your kit, 2 pieces of tape or 2 labels, and a 1000mm BL Touch wire extension kit that you can find in the description below. Let's begin by familiarizing ourselves with the kit contents of the genuine BL Touch. The BL Touch body itself has a security serial number and a version number on the PCB. We have 2 mounting springs, 2 3-pin and 2 2-pin DuPont connectors, and an accessory kit with screws, nuts, bolts, and other connectors. A star head screwdriver, a slot head screwdriver, some zip ties, an Arduino Uno, 5 female-to-female DuPont connectors, and 1 female-to-male DuPont connector. Notice the female-to-male has a probe on one side. We can start by separating the most important parts from the hardware pack that comes with the BL Touch. All we'll need is the 2 nuts and 2 bolts that hold it on. The rest of the connectors will be unneeded, but you should keep them around anyway just in case you might need them in the future. The first step in this process will be mounting the BL Touch to the bracket before we start the installation. Take the wires and fish them through the wire guide in the BL Touch mounting bracket. When oriented correctly, the BL Touch connector should be on the inside of the bracket, and the holes of the BL Touch should line up with the holes on the top of the bracket. Once you are satisfied with the orientation, it's time to screw the BL Touch into the mount. The 2 screws that we separated from the hardware pack go bottom up, so the head of the screw will be facing the floor. Notice here that we are starting with the back bracket, as this one is the hardest to do. Take one of the springs and put it on the bolt so that the largest part of the spring is facing the top of the mount. Take your thumb and put some pressure on the bolt as you thread it through. The spring is going to want to push it out, so while this is happening, take your star head screwdriver and we're going to use that to put some pressure on that bolt so that it doesn't fly out all the way. Put some pressure on it, but not too much, and then grab the whole assembly in a way that will allow the top of the bolt to peek out from the hole. After that, you can take one of your securing nuts and thread it onto the top so that we can release the pressure from the screwdriver. After the nut is secure, we can take our screwdriver and thread it on even more. Don't make it completely tight, turn it maybe 5 to 7 turns, just enough so that the spring has some tension and the nut isn't going to fall off. That's about the hardest part of the installation so far. Now that we've done that, we can put the front nut on, which should be fairly easy, and then move on with the installation. Move the BL Touch slightly out of the way so that you can thread that front nut on. And then we're going to repeat the same process by putting the other spring on, making sure the largest part of the spring is facing the mount. Then what we can do is just slightly move the BL Touch out of the way until we thread the screw into the hole. This way you can put a little bit of pressure on, take your screwdriver, put some pressure on the top so that it peeks out, hold the whole assembly again, and then put the other nut on. Ensure at this point that you tension the springs the same amount so that the BL Touch isn't leaning one way or the other. Snip snip, clip clip. It's time to use our clips. We're going to use them to remove the existing zip ties from the extruder assembly. That's because the wires for the BL Touch are going to go through this sleeve. It makes for a nice clean installation. Once those are removed, we're going to take our 2mm Allen key and we can use that to take the front cover off of the extruder assembly. We are going to use the same 2 screws that we just removed to attach the bracket to the main frame. We can start by pre-threading the screws in the bracket. This makes installation a lot easier. Thread the screws in just until you can see them pop out the other side. Repeat for the second screw. After this, we can take our bracket and we can screw it onto the front by overlaying it and lining up the holes with the original extruder cover. First, start with the top screw, as it's the most exposed and the easiest to screw in. Don't be surprised if it takes a little finagling to get it to thread in properly. There's no real way to make this look elegant on camera. You can see I'm struggling a little bit, but eventually you will find the hole and it will thread in. Next, we can move to our bottom screw. You can simply shove the BL Touch out of the way slightly on its springs and use the Allen key to screw that screw in properly. At the end of the process, check to make sure that the extruder bracket and the mount are secure. To begin our wiring and programming phase, remove the 2 screws at the front that hold the front cover on, also the 2 larger screws that hold the whole assembly to the frame. Slide your Y-axis all the way forward and remove the back motherboard cover screw. To make the job easier, we're going to slide our Y-axis all the way back, then we're going to take the motherboard cover off and disconnect the fan so that we can set the whole assembly aside. After that's done, you can take your printer and very carefully lay it on its back, making sure not to crush any wiring. There is one more screw on the back of the motherboard case that we need to remove the whole assembly. After that screw is removed, make sure that you support the whole motherboard case, and then take one hand and disconnect the Z pin end stop. We will actually not be using this cable anymore because we'll be using a BL Touch. Take your clips and clip the zip tie that's holding the whole cable assembly together. The next thing we need to do is separate the sleeve tape from the actual cables. This is very hard to do unless the seam is very obvious, so sometimes I have to take my clips and start it and then rip it off. Be very careful if you decide to go this route because there are wires everywhere, and if you cut one, you might be in for a real headache. Once you've made a small incision, it should be easy to rip the tape off from the seam you've created. Now we can start the process of fishing the extension cables through the sleeve to connect the BL Touch to the motherboard. Important to note here is that each wire has both a female and a male end. We're going to be fishing the wires in through male first to go to the BL Touch. This is important to get right, as it can be very disappointing if you fish the wrong end through and you realize your connectors don't work properly. Let's begin by locating the male end of each wire. Locate the extruder assembly sleeve. You'll notice that the sleeve is actually flexible, and as you bunch the sleeve up, the inside diameter actually becomes bigger. Take the sleeve and move it out of the way of the rest of the control box components. Take the 2 male ends of the extension cable and insert it into the sleeve. We can work the cable into the sleeve by a combination of pushing from the back and also working the sleeve kind of like the stomach of a snake, expanding and contracting the sleeve as we work the connectors through. This process can take a little bit of fiddling around, so just be patient and keep working at it. If you are successful, and you will be, you will see your 2 male ends pop out of the end eventually. At this point, we can gently pull on the wires to get them to go through the rest of the way. Turning back to our motherboard assembly, we are going to have to gain access to the 6 pins located beside the LCD connector. To do that, simply pop the LCD connector out of its housing and set it aside. You can see here that our motherboard has 2 rows of pins. Call this row 1 and row 2. Each of these pins has a number. Starting from row 1, we have pin 1, 2, and 3, and then in row 2, pin 4, 5, and 6. On our Arduino Uno, we also have 2 rows of 3 pins, labeled 1, 2, 3 in the first row, 4, 5, 6 in the second row. The best way to ensure success here during programming is to make sure that we color code our pins appropriately in a way that we understand. Depending on where your DuPont cable pack came from, the colors can be different. So what I like to do is write down on a piece of paper what color corresponds to what pin. In this case so far, we've got red on pin 6, now we have orange on pin 5, next we'll have yellow on pin 4. Pin 3 is a special pin. This is the pin that the female to male connector will get connected into. Pin 2 in this case is going to be a green connector. And pin 1 is going to be a brown colored connector. Sometimes you may have a color overlap like this. Just make sure you double check that each pin is going where it's supposed to be going by following the leads. On the Arduino side, we're going to connect our pin 1 brown to pin 1 of the Arduino, our pin 2 green to pin 2 of the Arduino. Our pin 3 female to male connector is going to connect to pin 10 of the Arduino. Our yellow pin 4 is going to connect to pin 4 of the Arduino. Our orange pin 5 is going to pin 5 of the Arduino. And then our last red pin 6 is going to pin 6 of the Arduino. Now we can fire up our Arduino by plugging it into the USB port of your computer. The Arduino should light up, and it should also power the motherboard of the printer. Press Burn Bootloader and you should see the Arduino do a little light dance. Now we are done with the Arduino. Unplug it from your computer and then unplug the cables. Our next step is to unplug the ZMIN cable. Notice that on the side there's usually some hot glue holding these connectors in. Take your screwdriver and very carefully pry away the hot glue, making sure not to damage anything. Take your time. The extension cables come pre-configured for some printers, but not for our Ender. We are going to have to remove some pins to make it manageable. To remove the pins, simply take your screwdriver and pry up on the plastic tabs holding them in, making sure not to overextend them and break them off. We will have to remove both the red and the orange pins from this housing. It's time to insert the pins in the correct configuration. What I'm going to do is take my screwdriver and use the head to push the tabs down just to make sure that they are actually going to grip the pins as we insert them. Next, take your red pin and insert it in the outermost slot so that there is a 1-pin space between red and brown. That's all you need to do here, as our orange pin is going to get spliced into another wire. The goal of the next step is to take the orange wire and splice it into the red wire of the LCD ribbon cable. This is called pin 27, and it's where the BL Touch gets its signals from to know when to deploy and to stow. To gain access to the red cable, we have to peel it away from the rest of the LCD ribbon cable assembly. Take a nail and slowly but surely pry it away from the assembly. Make sure you start prying it at a point that is at least 2 inches away from the connector of the LCD cable. Once it is separated, we can take our clips and cut it about 2.5 to 3 inches from the connector side. We will only be using the connector side of the cable, so you can take your clips and cut short the other side leading to the LCD. Next, we will take our orange cable and we're going to clip it right at the connector. Now that we have our red and orange wire ends free, we're going to take our wire strippers and strip off a length of wire and then braid the wires together. Take your heat shrink tubing and we're going to cut a portion that's about 1 inch or 1.25 inches long. Before we solder our wires together, it's important to get this tubing on so that we can use it to protect the solder joint. So let's fish it onto the end of our orange connector, making sure to get it well out of the way so it doesn't heat up when we solder the connectors together. To attach these wires together, let's use what's called a Western Union joint. That's where we cross the wires opposing each other, and we're going to wrap them around each other, kind of like a handshake. That way they'll both be gripping each other and we can just apply some solder to the joint and it should be nice and strong. Turn your iron on and make it nice and hot. It doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to work well. Apply some solder and make sure it flows through the whole joint nicely. After the soldering joint has sufficiently cooled, take your heat shrink and work it over the solder joint so that it's covering it evenly. Then you can take some residual heat from your soldering iron and use that to shrink the heat shrink tubing so that it is secure. To get power to our BL Touch, we'll be taking our red wire and plugging it into pin 4, and then we'll be taking our brown wire and plugging it into pin 6 of our 6-pin outlet on the motherboard. You can use an Allen key in the blank pin to help you line up and push in the connector. To plug in our black and white Z end stop connector, make sure that the black lead of the end stop connector is going to the first pin of the Z end stop that faces the inside of the board, and the white lead goes to the second one that faces the outside of the board. This is a critical connection, and if it's not made successfully, the whole BL Touch will not work. So make sure you use your Allen key to push the pins in and make sure it feels secure afterwards. We now need to replug the LCD screen connector now that it's been spliced properly. Simply plug it into its housing again. Let's turn our attention to our previously installed BL Touch and extension cables. We're going to connect our cables now together, making sure that white goes to white, black goes to black, and orange, red, and brown each go to their respective colors on the BL Touch. In the spirit of measuring twice and cutting once, make sure you do the visual confirmation to make sure the wires are going to their match. This is where our labels or tape come in. Because the printer head is always moving around, it's very easy for these connectors to become disconnected in the middle of a print. So what we need to do is place our label or our tape over the joint so that it securely holds both parts of the connector together. Before putting this printer back together, we're going to test to make sure all our connections work properly. Let's take our motherboard and we'll gingerly put it back where it belongs without screwing it in and making sure we're not going to snag any of the cables. Carefully rotate the printer upright. When we power the printer on, you should see the BL Touch do a self-test when the plunger goes up and down twice, and then it should glow red. If you've done this, it's successfully getting power. Now that we've confirmed things are working, we can start reassembling the printer again. Start by screwing in the motherboard housing. To hold all the wires together and to prevent wires from being pulled, we need to fish through one of our zip ties to make sure that we can hold the wiring harness together. Before pulling the tie tight, we want to make sure that our wires from our BL Touch have a little bit of slack in them. This will make sure they don't get pulled during the normal operation of the printer. After you are satisfied, you can use a pair of pliers to pull the tie tight. Making sure the motherboard connector is exposed for the fan, you can take the lid from the motherboard housing and plug the fan back in, and then we can reinstall the lid. Make sure not to forget the screw on the bottom for the motherboard housing. While we are underneath the printer, let's add some extra insurance to make sure the wiring is going to stay there properly. I like to take a second zip tie and zip tie it on the outside to make sure the wiring harness stays secure. Why not do a third? Zip ties are cheap, right? Let's end the physical installation process by replacing the zip ties that we had cut off earlier. Now that you have a BL Touch, you aren't going to need your Z minimum end stop anymore, and in fact it might get in the way. So what we're going to do is loosen the screws and take it off completely. take your USB cable and now you can plug it into the front of the printer. Because we put a bootloader on it, you will be able to flash it via USB. When you auto-home the printer, the X and Y should home each other and then move to the center to home the Z. If everything goes well, it should probe the bed twice. Now to set the Z offset. Go to the configuration menu and then go to Probe Z Offset. We are going to set this to a default value of negative 3.50 millimeters at first. Every time we set our Probe Z offset, we must click Store Settings or else the settings will not stick properly. After that, let's go to Main and let's go to Motion and we'll auto-home the printer again. After the printer is homed, we'll go to the Motion menu, then Move Axis. Then we'll go to Move Z and move it by an increment of 0.1 millimeters. This is going to allow us to figure out our Z offset. Put a paper between the bed and the nozzle and then slowly move the head down until it just starts to grip the paper. If you are used to bed leveling the normal way, where you do the four corners in the piece of paper until it just starts to stick, which you can find in our Ender 3 setup guide, you're looking for the same feeling, just so that it grips but not so that it stops the movement of the paper. After we're satisfied, let's check the LCD and see how much Z is left. Here you can see we have positive 0.5 millimeters. So what we're going to do is take that value and add that to our Probe Z offset, and that should set the offset correctly. Let's navigate in the menu back to the configuration menu and then we can set the probe offset. Because the probe offset is negative 3.5 and we have positive 0.5 left, we're going to add that positive 0.5 to our Z probe offset, which should leave us with negative 3 as our total Z probe offset. As always, make sure you click Store Settings or else it will not work properly. Next, we must configure Cura. Go to Settings, select your printer, and then go to Manage Printers. Next, go to Machine Settings and look at your Start G-code. Notice we have a G28 that homes all axes. After that though, we must put a new line and then put G29 for our BL Touch homing. Click Close, and then click Close again. This is to show you the differences between the G28 and G29. A G28 will just home in the center, but a G29 will make a grid by measuring 9 points throughout the bed, as you can see here. Now your bed should have awesome auto leveling.